Right. So we're diving into something pretty interesting today. The idea that all problems are interpersonal relationship problems.
Oh, yeah. That's a bold statement, isn't it?
It really is. And I'm curious to see if it actually uh, holds up, you know? Like when you
Yeah.
first hear it, it sounds a little extreme.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it makes you wonder, like, is it really possible that every single problem we face ultimately comes down to our relationships with others?
Yeah, exactly. Like even the problems we think are totally personal, like our
Yeah.
own insecurities or anxieties.
Right.
The source material we're looking at uses the example of loneliness
Okay.
to kind of illustrate this point.
Okay.
And it argues that feeling lonely isn't just about physically being alone. Like it's more about feeling excluded
Yeah.
from a community or a group.
It's about that sense of belonging. Right.
Yeah.
Like you could be surrounded by people and still feel incredibly lonely
Totally.
if you don't feel like you connect with them on a deeper level.
But wouldn't someone with social anxiety maybe feel less lonely if they were by themselves?
That's a good question.
Doesn't that then contradict the idea that loneliness is always about feeling excluded?
It's true, loneliness is complicated. But even someone who's anxious in social situations probably still craves connection
Yeah,
on some level.
right.
They might feel lonely because they struggle to form those relationships that they actually want.
So even when you're talking about social anxiety, it still kind of circles back to relationships in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
It's interesting that the source also brings up this image of someone stranded on a deserted island.
Okay.
They'd probably still be thinking about other people,
Right.
like family or friends back home.
That's true.
Our brains are just wired for connection, it seems, even when we're totally isolated.
So, okay, I can see how this idea might apply to like emotional struggles,
Mm-hmm.
like loneliness or, some of those bigger questions about life and stuff.
Yeah.
But what about more practical problems?
Wait, what?
Like problems that seem to exist outside of ourselves, like global issues or problems in society.
Right.
Could you really say that those are all relationship problems too?
That's where things get even more interesting.
Yeah.
The source acknowledges that not everyone is going to buy into this idea.
Okay.
It presents this counter-argument through a character in the dialogue, a young person who kind of pushes back against the idea that all problems are interpersonal.
So what kind of problems does this young person see as like outside the realm of relationships?
Well, they bring up things like the fear of death
Okay.
or the search for meaning in life.
Yeah.
Those existential questions.
Right.
They argue that these are like fundamental human experiences that go beyond just our social connections.
I can see that, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So is the source basically saying that we should just dismiss those anxieties or those big existential questions?
No, not at all. It's more about considering how even these struggles that feel really personal
Yeah.
are often shaped by the social context that we live in.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. So like our cultural beliefs about death
Yeah.
or the values we attach to a meaningful life,
Right.
those are often influenced by the communities that we're a part of.
So even though those big questions might feel really personal to us, the way we think about them is still influenced by, our relationships and the world around us.
Exactly. We're not grappling with these things in a vacuum.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm already starting to kind of rethink some of my assumptions about, where my problems come from.
I know. It's interesting, isn't it?
This deep dive is definitely giving me a new perspective on things.
I think that's what's so fascinating about this idea.
Yeah,
It makes us consider how interconnected our experiences really are.
yeah.
Even the ones that we think are totally personal and internal.
So we've talked about like loneliness and those bigger existential things, but how does this idea of all problems being relationship problems apply to like those more practical everyday problems? Like what if I'm struggling at work or having money problems?
Yeah, those are great examples.
Are those really relationship problems too?
It might seem a bit of a stretch at first,
Yeah.
but the source really encourages us to think about how even those practical problems often have something to do with our relationships.
Okay, can you give me an example though?
Sure.
Because like on the surface, it seems like something like losing your job, for example, could be totally unrelated to your relationships.
Yeah, I get what you mean.
Yeah.
So let's use job loss as an example.
Okay.
The source wouldn't say that relationships are like the direct cause of losing your job in every case.
Okay.
But it would say that how someone responds to that job loss, how they deal with it, the kind of support they have to get through it, that's often heavily influenced by their relationships.
So it's not about like blaming our relationships for our problems,
No.
but more about understanding how those relationships play a role in our experiences.
Exactly. Think about it. Someone who has a strong support system like close friends and family, they might find it easier to cope emotionally when they lose a job. They might have people to talk to help them find a new job, maybe even financial help if they need it.
Yeah.
But someone who's more isolated, who doesn't have that kind of network, they might struggle more,
Yeah.
feel more hopeless.
So it's almost like having good relationships gives you this buffer, like a safety net to help you when things get tough.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And this idea isn't just for big events like losing your job. It can apply to like everyday conflicts too.
Yeah, like those little arguments we have with family or coworkers.
Exactly.
How do those fit into this whole idea?
Well, remember how we were talking about how our deepest fears and desires are shaped by our relationships?
Uh-huh.
It's the same kind of thing with those everyday interactions, those little conflicts.
So like if I'm always disagreeing with someone at work, it might not just be about the work itself.
Right.
It might be about something deeper going on between us.
Yeah, like some underlying tension,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe we're just not communicating very well. The source argues that if we can understand those relationship dynamics, we can often get to the root of the problem
Okay.
and then figure out better solutions. It's about seeing conflict as a chance to learn and grow instead of just something to avoid.
But isn't that what people do in therapy a lot of the time?
Huh?
Like dealing with their internal struggles?
Yeah.
So how does therapy fit into this whole idea of every problem being a relationship problem?
That's a really good point. It's true that therapy often focuses on helping people work through their own thoughts and feelings.
Right.
But even in therapy, relationships are usually a big part of the conversation.
In what way?
Well, therapists often talk to their clients about their past relationships,
Mm-hmm.
their childhood, their parents,
Yeah.
to see how those early experiences might be affecting them now.
Right.
And even when therapy is focused on individual growth, it can still help people learn to communicate better and build healthier relationships.
So even therapy, which can feel very focused on the individual, it still acknowledges how important relationships are.
Yeah, exactly.
It's all starting to make sense now, how it all connects.
It's like all the pieces of the puzzle are falling into place.
Yeah.
And this whole framework doesn't mean we're not responsible for our own choices.
Right.
It's more about recognizing that we're not alone. Our relationships are the context for our whole lives.
Yeah.
And they shape how we see and respond to our problems.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. It's not about blame. It's about seeing the bigger picture. So if relationships are both like the source of our problems and the key to solving them, where do we even start?
Right.
Yeah, that is the big question, isn't it?
Mhm.
Where do we start? If it's all about relationships, like how do we actually use that to figure things out?
Yeah, it's not like there's this magic formula or anything.
Right.
But what the source suggests is kind of a shift in how we think about problems.
Okay.
Instead of just trying to fix something inside ourselves or overcome some obstacle,
Yeah.
we should try to look at how our relationships are involved.
So instead of thinking like, oh, I need to be more confident or I need to work harder, I should also be thinking about how my relationships are affecting those things.
Yeah. It's about realizing that everything's connected. Like, say you're struggling with self-esteem.
Okay.
It might be helpful to think about the messages you got about your worth when you were growing up, like from your family.
Yeah.
Are those messages still kind of sticking with you even now, even if they're not really true?
It's like those early relationships built this foundation and we're still kind of operating on that foundation.
Yeah. And just like relationships can be part of the problem, they can also be a huge source of strength.
Right.
Like, think about times when you felt really supported and understood.
Mm-hmm.
How did those relationships help you through tough times?
For me, I know having close friends and family who believe in me, that makes a world of difference when I'm struggling. Their encouragement, their perspective, it helps me bounce back.
Yes, exactly. Relationships give us this sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. They help us process our emotions, see things in new ways, and ultimately, they help us grow.
This has been such a mind-bending deep dive. I started out thinking, how can all problems be relationship problems?
It's a wild idea when you first hear it, right?
It really is. But now I'm starting to see the connections even in areas where I wouldn't have thought about it before.
That's what's so cool about exploring new ideas. It's not about blindly accepting everything, but about letting those ideas kind of stretch our understanding of things.
So even though it might sound extreme at first, the idea that all problems are interpersonal relationship problems, it gives us a really interesting framework for understanding how our inner world and our outer experiences are connected.
And maybe even more importantly, it makes us appreciate just how powerful relationships
Yeah.
are. They can really impact our well-being, and they can also be a source of healing and growth.
This has been an amazing conversation, and we'd love to hear what you think. Have you ever considered that your problems might be connected to your relationships? And if so, how has that changed the way you try to solve those problems?
I'll leave you with that to think about as you continue to explore your own life and the incredible world of human connection.
Until next time, keep learning and keep connecting.